Thank you all for these incredible presentations. We're now going to have a comment from Dr. Ezgi Yildiz, who's a visiting scholar here at the Center for European Studies, excuse me. Dr. Yildiz holds a PhD degree in international relations with a minor in international law from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. She specializes in the European human rights regime, international courts and tribunals, legal interpretation, human rights, and political violence. She comes to CES from the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she was a postdoctoral fellow in the 2016 through 17 academic year.
So first of all, I want to congratulate all of you for these excellent presentations and also write-ups. I really enjoyed reading your work. And as I was telling to Hannah and others as well, I was really impressed with the way you design your projects, the way you collected data, mostly primary sources as well, and you argue. So it's really great, and I was really pleased to get to know your projects more as well. So I typed up most of my comments, and I'm happy to send them along because I don't know whether I'll be able to tell you all today. Let's start with individual papers, and I will go with the order. So let's start with Romana. Romana, this is a very interesting paper on elite mobilization, and you definitely identify a good, interesting gap in the literature. And this does not only, in a way, deepen our understanding of what happened in Croatia, but also can show us the trends in the region. And your case is particularly interesting because it's not only transition from communism to democracy, but also transition in the context of an ethnic war. And you're looking at the elite dynamics there, so it's really interesting there. And one of the questions I have is the definition of elite there. You define it as a top-level actor with a decision-making power. And I was wondering if there's any economic dimension there. Are there any separate elites for that? And also, does elitism run in the family in the context? Is it like hard work? Is it like kind of a heritage? And I also wanted to hear more about the incentives to remain in politics versus leaving the politics. So what is the opportunity cost? What do they miss on when they leave? Are they better off, the ones who leave versus the ones staying? And finally, what did you find about the connection between elites? Are they a close-knit group? Do they carry on their network as they go along and move to the new jobs or new careers, whatever they do? And because you have individual level analysis, you could very easily show the network they have using network. That would be fascinating to see. And yeah, just tell us a bit more about your findings and how they can show the case of Croatia and general trends in the region as well. And moving to Andrew, this is a really interesting and ambitious project with great potential. And you definitely gave a lot of thought and did not refrain from getting into a very messy and difficult subject. So congrats on that, you know, like I encourage you. And reading your write-up, I had the impression first that you really wanted to only focus on Turkish case and the comparisons came later. But then the presentation convinced me the other way. I think you worked on it since then. And I like your argument that military ideology determines the civilian response. But I have a feeling that you need to expand this in the sense that I guess what you're trying to look at that whether military ideology also has social legitimacy, not only in the eyes of the civil society, but society at large. Maybe that could help you a bit more there. And I also really like your framework to explain the ways civilian governments can control the military, namely the gradualist institutionalist versus confrontational populist. And in the write-up, especially in the write-up, not so much in the presentation, you rely a lot on Huntington's work, and I wasn't sure if Huntington is helping you at all. I felt like your framework was doing a much better job in explaining it, and why are we even using him that much anyways? And another thing that came to my mind thinking about the Turkish case, and since I'm Turkish, I know that a bit more, One of the other strategies that AKP government used was also infiltrating the government in the military. Like that's why we had the Gülenists in the first place in the military. So I don't know whether that also happened in the other cases, or could that be a different strategy on its own? And finally, and we can definitely talk more because I have more comments for you. For the Turkish case, you said that your main premise is that army was the first mover, and then you specifically look at the 2007 e-memorandum. And that got me thinking, because I wasn't sure. First of all, I'm not sure if you can really establish a causality, directionality here with certainty, especially in Turkey where you have history of coup d'etat. Like you start from 1980s, but especially to understand this case, you have to go to 1960s, the first one. I feel like, because as you know, the story that the military takes over and captures the then Prime Minister, Minister of Finance and Foreign Affairs, and hang the Prime Minister and the other three as well. And then Prime Minister Adnan Menderes is an ideological predecessor of Erdogan. So I wonder if that memory was already haunting him. That memory already gave him the, like the idea, also the right motives to control the military, even early on, even before 2007. So maybe the threat came much earlier. Again, we can discuss more on this. And Teresa, this is also really interesting paper, and I really like the fact that you went there and did archival research, because it really gives credibility to your work. And it really also reads very well, as most of all of you guys. I mean, you did a great job in writing as well. So my question is about so these authors wrote in English for an American or international audience, and how did their work differ from the ones that they write for their domestic audience? Maybe you can tell us a bit more about that. And then you also talk about Encounter's broader mission of cultural diplomacy. And I really find this interesting. And maybe you could tell us more about what is diplomatic about dissident literature. Maybe what are the implications of it as well. And it would be also useful to hear how Encounter was viewed in the West and in America. And how did they take it with a grain of salt? Especially before the CIA funding revelations and all, did people really trust it? And who else was publishing there as well? Maybe, like a bit of description would help the readers. And I was also very much curious to know more about what happened to these people, the dissidents as well, their fates, even after their participation in Encounter. Maybe you can tell us more about that too. And Margot, and this is also a very insightful project, and you have a very beautiful way of writing about this also very difficult subject, and I was impressed with your approach, and I welcome your suggestions for reconceptualization of violence and healing. And but oftentimes I was thinking about what kind of violence you're talking about. I wasn't entirely sure if it's like, are there elements of physical violence, or is it just structural or symbolic violence? And if you're talking about all kind of different types of violence, does healing change, or is it the same mechanisms of healing? And what I also saw that this is a short write-up, of course, I haven't seen your thesis work or your chapter, but I felt like there was a bit of discontinuity between the part that you talk about your ethnographic work and then the part you present your findings and conclusions. More specifically, I wasn't able to trace how your observations were taking you to your conclusions. There was like a step missing, but maybe that's in the chapter and I haven't seen it. And finally, maybe we can talk more. The ethical dimension of this work, and as an anthropologist, you know this more than I do. Your presentation gave me more details about that, but I was also wondering, how many people did you talk to, and did they know that you were doing this project? So that would be also interesting to know. And then how did you analyze your field notes? I mean, also did the university know how you were using them? So that would be also nice to see as a reader as well. Finally, Sturgios, sorry, I didn't really have a chance to see your movie yet, but I will definitely be there. And this is really fascinating and very well done project. And you also do a great job in showing the cyclical nature of this human tragedies coming on, and also going, in a way, taking place in the same geographic location. That was really beautiful. And just one question I have for you is that I see that a lot of young people participated and joined you and then also took your courses. But how did the rest of the population take the whole project? Did they see it? Will they see the final movie? And how do we influence your grade, by the way, if you come to see the movie? Like, is there a way that we can help you more?
Sorry, influence the what?
Influence your final grade for your project.
Yeah, just clap hard.
All right, we will do that. Well, on that note, thank you so much for giving me this chance to get to know your projects more, and I'm happy to talk to you more after as well and send you my comments and discuss further if you have questions. Thank you.
So we'll give our panelists an opportunity if they'd like to comment or respond to Dr. Yildiz, and then we'll open the floor for questions afterwards. Does anyone? Sure.
So you mentioned the definition of the elite, and what I've found, there's a large literature based on defining the elite, what it means to be a member of the elite, and there are elites in different sectors. So I'm focusing on the political elite, but then one particular form of elite movement involves elites who, from the political sector, become business elites in the new democracy. So the economic dimension would be basically the elites in the business sector. And if it runs in the family, that's a very interesting question. There's, so communism lasted for a pretty long time, so it wouldn't have run, there are two different types of elites. There are the elites before communism and the elites during communism. So there's one possibility, which I'm not examining in my work, where the elites before communism skipped a generation and then their children could have potentially been involved in political structures in the democracy. So that's not something that I'm examining, but it's very interesting to think about. The incentives to remain in politics. So the way that the Communist Party structures worked, usually people had some other form of employment in addition to being involved in the Central Committee of the League of Communists of Croatia. So when I'm looking at elite movement, I'm looking at it from the perspective of the people as politicians, but also from the perspective of people in their other jobs. So, for example, one of my interviewees was a professor and was working in the Central Committee of the League of Communists of Croatia. And then after the democratic transition, he decided not to be in politics and he just continued being a professor. So that's something that I'm definitely considering. It's very interesting that you mention elite networks, because that was my original conception of the project, was going to be looking at elite networks to see how elites use their networks to move after the democracy. But I've taken that component out at this point, but I could definitely try and add it in, look into adding it in with the surviving elites. Yeah. Yes, thank you so much for your comments.
Likewise, Dr. Yildiz, thank you very much for your comments. I think your point about how the memory of military intervention in Turkey is absolutely something that I think stayed with President Erdogan. And as people who study Turkey will know, as recently as 1997, the military had deposed the Islamist government of Necmettin Erbakan, and Erdogan himself had been imprisoned for allegedly Islamist activities. But what's interesting is the political science literature on this question would predict that this memory and this history of repression should have led the AKP to be more democratic. And in fact, scholars in Chile argued that one reason why the socialists became so committed to democracy after the Pinochet dictatorship was because they had gone through similar experiences that the AKP had gone through. Their party had been shut down. They themselves had been tortured, arrested, killed. And people argued that this experience should lead to increased appreciation for democracy. And I think basically what Erdogan learned was that no matter how moderate he became in the eyes of the Turkish military, they were never going to let the AKP occupy major positions of power like the presidency. And so I think that political learning essentially pushed the AKP towards more democratic strategies where they thought they might be able to moderate enough to get the military to allow them to access these kinds of positions. But then they essentially learned that no matter how moderate they became, they would never be able to succeed as long as the military had this ideology opposing them. And I think your point about Gülenist infiltration of the military really sort of, I think I should incorporate into my paper, because I think it strengthens this importance about ideology. Essentially, the AKP realized in 2007 the only way to actually make the military docile was to replace secularists in the military with people who were loyal to sort of the Gülen movement, which is an Islamist movement in Turkey. And I think that strengthens the idea that really what the AKP was trying to accomplish was personnel change rather than sort of institutional oversight of some kind. And then I think your point about social legitimacy, just to conclude, is really important. Because I think one of the questions I'm still trying to deal with in my analysis of the Turkish case is why the 1997 postmodern coup succeeds, the 2007 memorandum does not. And I think eventually I really need to look at sort of social transformations in Turkey that lead to acceptance from secularist parties in the 1997 intervention, whereas those same groups are not willing to go along with the military in 2007. I think your point about sort of broader social changes making the public more or less receptive to the military ideology is that something we need to include.
Yeah, thank you so much for your comments. And to answer some of these questions, I think, first of all, a lot of the work that was published in Encounter was these authors were not allowed to publish in their own country. So their books were banned and their publishing channels were also banned. And that was the case for most of them. For instance, Miloš, who is the subject of my first chapter, he had actually already defected from the Polish government at the time when he was publishing in Encounter. So he had defected, he was banned there, and he was broadly incorporated into a lot of the Congress for Cultural Freedom activities, like the conferences and things like that they held as well. So that would be the difference from what's going on in their home countries. And then I think, yeah, your question about what's diplomatic about dissident literature, I think is very interesting because that's kind of one of the core points that I'm trying to get at here, where so a lot of the arguments about literature being diplomatic in the first place in this instance had to do with the fact that communist governments mandated socialist realism, which was like a realistic style of composing fiction and other literature. And so a lot of modernist authors and other experimental authors were then employed in this sort of argument for the Western side of the Cold War. And so I think in this case, what's diplomatic about dissident literature is that, I mean, it's one thing to have Western authors, opposing the socialist realist constructs, but then it's another thing to have authors from those countries publishing in Western channels and defying those constraints. And so I think that just actually creates a much stronger case for the diplomatic aims that Encounter was going for. And yeah, the point about how Encounter was viewed in the West was actually something very interesting to come out of my archival research, because Encounter was fairly clearly a Cold War informed publication. And the Congress for Cultural Freedom was, I mean, it wasn't completely opaque, but in terms of its mission, it was anti-communist definitively, and it was opaque about that. But it was quite well respected in the West, and I found a lot of newspaper clippings and like letters sent into the editors from prominent Western intellectuals at the time who really respected the publication, which I think, grants a greater deal of legitimacy to it as I saw it as I was going through the archives. So thank you for your comments.
Thank you very much. I think you're very right about there being different approaches to healing, depending on the different types of violence that these women experience. I am more thorough in my actual thesis, but some examples of violence that they face is the violence of performing a cookie-cutter narrative for life history for asylum application. The violence of police deportation threats, physical violence from clients, from other sex workers, from other people on the street, from within the Nigerian community. So those are some examples, but that will definitely be clear. I also hope that in my thesis, any discontinuities between ethnographic descriptions and theoretical findings are smoothed, and that won't be a problem, but I will be working on that. And for the ethical dimension, I didn't quite understand about the field note comment that you made.
So
your observations and your conclusions are super interesting. And I was like, how did they lead you, your notes, to arrive there? Maybe, since I'm also not in the anthropology, you could just, walk us
Yeah.
by it and,
Yeah, so I guess the process of observation to findings is you observe during the day, you have interviews, you write everything down word for word, like just replaying the entire day in your mind, and then you reread, you code your field notes to uncover what patterns present themselves, what anomalies that contradict the patterns, what's interesting, and then group together. I mean, that's just like chapter organization, but regarding the consent of participants, I was definitely clear about letting them know that I was doing a project, and in total I did interview some women at a different field site, and in total I collected 12 interviews and then spent one-on-one or group time extensively with around six individuals, and I think never mind, but so they were all aware of the project, and I got oral consent from them. Written consent is a little complicated for them since many of them have a history of a debt contract that they're repaying in Europe. So having a written contract is not a great, yeah. So thank you for your comments, though.
Yeah, well, I think your question about, thank you for your comments, and I'm excited for you to see the film, and we can talk more afterwards. But the question of audience is a really important one, and one that I'm grappling with. Like, is this meant to be for a room full of Harvard students? Is this meant to be for a Greek audience? Is this meant to be for an international audience, refugee audience, et cetera? I do think part of it is not catered to, but like, my own experiences being Greek and sort of like living with the refugee crisis in the background, and it's like, it's easy to remove yourself from it. But I think sort of like part of what I was just like delving into both my own family history and then like Greek history and refugee movements and the sort of cyclical natures of various like migration movements and how similar they are visually. I think that's a really important thing for a Greek audience to sort of think about, but an international audience as well, because Greeks are not, unfortunately, like not the only ones who dictate like what migration laws, and so, and then I've been collaborating with the students in sort of, a lot of this was shooting and responding to what was happening without clearly knowing how the two things are connected. Like, I knew that there was some sort of like echo between the classes, and that this story of the Reem's grandmother going to the, like her uncovering this sort of like refugee past through images. But I didn't quite, so now it's been, and I think the project definitely isn't done yet, or it's not where I want it to be. The next step for me is like, I've been sort of been working backwards with the students and seeing how their reflections on image making and their experience can both illuminate parts of the fictional story, and then how the fictional story can frame a lot of things that they're going. And part of it is also like the sort of media parallel, which is this young woman who's shooting with this film camera, having no knowledge of how to use it. That's why like a lot of the photos are blurred or sort of like fragments of memory. From especially like a young woman, in Greece during World War II would not have access to a camera or have knowledge of the skills of how to use it. She gains access effectively through killing a German soldier and stealing it and learns just by taking images, but without the ability to view them because of this sort of delayed response of film technology, essentially. How is that complicated in the modern day where, these students came to me through a Facebook photo submission context of photos they had taken on their iPhone, which is incredible. And then, we met up and still have discourse about this project, like all online and through Skyping. So I think the technology element is really interesting. And, now access to learning photography is much easier. And so I see, part of why I brought up the Syrian Film Collective in the beginning is because what they do is basically have an open forum site where various filmmakers in Syria can upload content anonymously, but it's sort of curated. It's sort of like self-curated by the collective, which allows the sort of like artist as producer of their own work by bypassing sort of other contracted producers of photographs. Like the NGO will have photographers who will take photos of refugees, and then those will be used for self-promotion and also for awareness, which I think is important. I don't think that outsiders have no place taking photos, but it's very different when, you know, the people, like a lot of refugees who do feel like they are misrepresented in the media, get a chance to filter their own experiences. And that part of the project is not where I want it to be yet. I feel like that's really fertile ground for this movie to expand. So I've been Skyping and talking with them and seeing, they've sort of been providing interviews and voiceover to recontextualize their photos to fit in this idea of like ownership and vision and justice ultimately.
Great, thank you guys. I'll open the floor. Are there questions for our panelists?
I also have to leave in 5 minutes. If anybody wants to go first, if I could go first, if anybody has any comments, that'd be great. Because I have to go to my graduation ceremony.
Right.
Sorry, I'll let you go because I don't have a question for you other than huge congratulations to you and to everybody in the panel, also to the previous panelists. Very, very impressive work by everybody. Well done. Send us the link where we can watch it if we cannot make it next Thursday.
Yeah.
But I want to ask a question for the first two presentations. So if there's somebody who wants to ask something else.
I might ask a quick. I actually might take advantage of my role in asking a question for the final three, because it seems like just coming up from microphone, so I'm hiding it as I ask my question. It seems like the three of you are all engaging in these really interesting issues of like narrative, self-construction, and sort of storytelling and memory, but in very different ways in terms of sort of dissident literature as this sort of political story that is empowered, right? That they're given a voice and empowered for political reasons, so they're able to tell their story, but someone is sort of maybe behind the scenes. There's a question about what motivation is. These Nigerian sex workers, so I think the point about the narratives they have to construct for the asylum applications, I think is a really interesting point, that they also are constructing narratives, but it's kind of forced on them and they're not able to tell an authentic story. And so there's sort of another spin on that same dynamic versus then also this idea of refugees who are either a story is told about them by journalists versus their ability to mobilize and tell their own story. And the sort of thread that runs through there about trauma and about either trying to remember and using narrative as a way to remember and process, or the really interesting point, Margot, that you made of actually maybe not wanting to do that, right? Of a different way of dealing with trauma that has to do with not engaging it through art. So I wonder if the three of you have kind of drawn anything from each other's presentations, which maybe is sort of unfair way to put you on the spot, but asking you to sort of reflect on these kind of very diverse approaches that you're taking to a similar set of themes, and to what extent you see there being some kind of a conversation among the three of you.
Well, I think the sort of framework of distance management is really interesting when it comes to visual storytelling as well. Like I touched on it briefly, but like the sort of a lot of the people that I worked with, like there's sort of insistence to take photos of things that are very like unrelated to their trauma as a way of like coping with it. Like that was very illuminating to me. And I talk a lot, or like I've thought a lot about the asylum process as a form of like coerced storytelling and construction of narrative, as you were saying, and you know, having to sort of replay and convince people of all your trauma. Yeah, but I think, yeah, that's just given me a lot to think about, and that's something that I've been trying to include in the film. Is like the fact that their reality is not this like sexy notion of like refugee camps, but it's like really intense like boredom, like sort of imposed by bureaucracy of like they're just like waiting for something to happen, especially when they're still in Greece and they're sort of in this transit zone. They're waiting for asylum papers, their interviews, and sort of like photography of the mundane is a way to like cope with, like the overwhelming sentiment that I got from them is like how fun it is. Like I'm in this foreign place. Also, there's like a parallel to like like sort of not tourism, but like Greece is such a place where there's like millions of tourists taking photos, and within that you have these refugees that are just sort of stuck in Athens, like waiting for their papers, trying to find jobs, and then they're taking photos also like of the Parthenon and the landscapes, but like through a very different way. And I don't know. I think that there's like something there.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I think what originally attracted me to my topic was that it's a point when the American government acknowledges that experimental literature has a political purpose, which at the time I thought was pretty rare. And so I think since I've encountered it first, and I'm thinking about all of these ways that writers from a basically inaccessible part of the world to a Western consciousness sort of came forward and were able to represent themselves to audiences reading in English, I think I'm seeing a lot of issue, like the same, not the same, but you, Sergio's talking about how you're so conscious about how you're representing your subjects, and just like a lot of the issues that you were thinking through with your film, I think are maybe not the same, but sort of in conversation. And I think it was really interesting to hear about how conscious you were about consent, and also just like the ways that you were representing your subjects through film.
Quickly, because I know you have to leave, but I guess two things. For your project, the idea of coming from an inscrutable, almost inaccessible place behind the curtain and being a cultural ambassador in a sense, that resonates with my my work for the Nigerian women who, in a sense, are representing Nigeria, and more like largely, if a French person can't distinguish between a Nigerian and just labels them an African immigrant, they're representing Africa. And so the idea of self-representation is interesting. In my work, it's a physical, present, like tactile almost representation, but for yours, I think it's very interesting to look at the nuance of written representation. And for Sturgios, your comment when you were talking about boredom and just waiting around for bureaucracy to roll on makes me think of something that I don't explore a lot in my thesis, but I think about, which is the notion of waitinghood, which is linked to migration and refugee status, where you're in a liminal state between citizenship and non-citizenship, and just the spaces of waiting and the process of waiting for something to happen, and not having ownership of your time or your environment. And I have also definitely been thinking about representation from the outside, of photographers taking pictures, especially with images of migrants between Libya and Italy, visual representation of what it is to be a migrant crossing to Europe. And then within France, what is the representation of a sex worker? Legally, how is it understood from an exterior point, rather than how is it understood by the sex workers themselves?
That's great. Thank you. Thanks for indulging this question. And so we have another question. Sturgios, we'll let you leave. And we have a question for other panelists.
These are really great presentations.
Right,
Please.
so yeah, quickly on the first presentation. So, Erwana, you presented the case of Croatia, and without except for the kind of quick reference to that official who was a Serb, ethnic Serb. Otherwise, there was no nationalism. That didn't come up in your presentation. I found this quite strange. I don't know whether it was choice or kind of oversight in some way, because obviously Tuđman, yes, so we know that the Communist Party continued to be in power afterwards. So the communist elite, let's say, continued to be in power afterwards, and we know, I think, that also this happened at least in part because of nationalism. Yeah, because of the dissolution of Yugoslavia, because the communist elite reinvented themselves as the kind of Croat nationalist, the safeguard of the nation itself. And then surely then this had a particular impact on who continued, who reproduced themselves in the elite, and who didn't, who shifted to businesses. Also, we know, I mean, you can think also in former Soviet Union that a lot of kind of economic, political corruption is in the elite, and then it happened also in Croatia. So this kind of dictated a lot what happened, and I wonder whether you should kind of acknowledge this in a different way, especially with regard to the way you motivated your thesis in relation to, we know what happened in Hungary, but nobody has looked at Croatia. Yeah, so how would you respond to that? And then if I can ask a question for Andrew as well. So I liked very much this also I think Harvard style of really putting forward your thesis, and my explanation is this. We have less of that in Europe, so very good. But then at some point I thought you kind of ended up with an almost circular argument, because when you went to that, I think it was your kind of the way the third or fourth kind of proposition you were putting forward, what explains things is the ability of the military to, I don't remember now exactly how you phrased it, but if they have the ideology that allows them to maintain control.
To win civilian support.
To win civilian support, exactly, yes. And then, as an economist, this automatically rang bells saying, oh, endogeneity, this is endogenous, so you're actually trying to explain something, and you went many steps in order to arrive there. And at the end, it's still, because it depends a lot on history and civil society and the power of the political elites, whether the military would have this ability to do that. And I was thinking, when you're presenting the cases of the reference to the king for Thailand and anti-communism in Chile, in the case of Turkey and Thailand, you have this very kind of fixed guarantors of the system. In Turkey, you have Kemal. Yeah, and the military can always refer to Kemal to say, we're not, we're a secular state, this is what it was always, so it's super powerful. And I guess, I know very little about Thailand, but I guess also in Thailand you can say the king, even in a token way, represents this kind of the same figure. Whereas then in Chile you didn't have that, and with the atrocities of the dictatorship, the whole thing was delegitimized. So I wonder whether you could start from that instead of sort of going the long way and then arriving at the ideology of the military, but rather giving more emphasis to the historical, political, I guess, context. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for your comment. So I didn't really touch upon the nationalist issue in this, but I'm going to have one chapter or part of a chapter where I go over the history of what happened in Croatia with the dissolution of Yugoslavia, and I'm definitely going to mention the nationalism at that point. So Tudjman was indeed a communist, but he spent a lot of time being a dissident before then coming back into politics. So basically what that sort of highlights is the fact that the numbers that you get for elites who remained in politics or circulated to other sectors depends a lot on how you define the elite. So at a certain point, yes, he was a member of the communist elite, and then immediately before the transition, he wasn't necessarily a member of the communist elite, but rather a dissident. So I asked my interviewees one question in particular about Yugoslav identity and how closely they were tied to the Yugoslav identity. So even all of these people who were members of the Communist Party, most of them, the grand majority of them still lean left at this point and they vote for the leftist party. But they didn't strongly identify with this Yugoslav identity. The grand majority of them identified as Croats. So even though they were on the left side, which arguably was pro-Yugoslav, they didn't have a strong tie to that. And the other component of that is the fact that the Communist Party itself reformed and it initiated the multi-party democratic elections. So the the question of nationalism is definitely tricky, and in the ethnic context of my project, I'm definitely going to continue considering it. And yes, I'm going to continue thinking about it. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you very much as well. I think your point about how in Turkey and Thailand, you have these two very significant figures, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and then King Bhumibol Adulyadej, who have sort of cast tremendous shadows over the future democratic government. And I think you're right that you could say at a certain level, there's a similar historical and political context that predisposes the militaries because they have this sort of guarantor that they can appeal to. And I think that I decided to focus more crucially on the role of ideologies as opposed to this comparison, just because what's interesting is that not only domestic politics, but the international environment, I think, can provide a form of ideology. So the Chilean military, for example, never had someone like a Kemal or a king to which they could appeal. But up until the end of the Cold War, they did have a very powerful ideology and rationale for intervention. So I think the reason I focused on ideology as opposed to deeper structural factors is that sometimes militaries can come up with ideologies even when they don't have this deeper political history. But I think you're very right that historical and political context makes military ideologies much more enduring in the Turkish and the Thai cases. And then I think your point about endogeneity with winning civilian support is really important, because I think one of the big unanswered questions of my thesis as of yet is, why is it that in Turkey, the military ideology does not succeed in winning civilian support, while in the Thai case it does? And I think you're right that I have to do a lot more work on thinking about how that might be endogenous to factors on the civilian side of the equation. If you have any ideas, let me know.
Great. Well, I think we will thank our panelists very warmly and perhaps have the opportunity to continue the conversation informally. I just also want to really thank everyone who presented today for these wonderful projects. It's really a great honor for Michael and me. We worked with some of you when you were writing your research proposals last year, and it's just really, really special for us to watch these projects develop over time. It's very gratifying to see you presenting this spectacular research now. So thank you all, and thank you to our audience as well.